Thank you. All right, should we start? Can somebody close that door in the back just so it's quieter? Okay. All right, so this conference is about future of industries and the role of AI in that general vein. So what we're going to do today is we're going to do 3 fireside chats. We're going to look at what's being done in 3 different industries, in law, in lending and financial services, and then in the industrial sector. And what hopefully you will see is there's a few things I want you to keep in the back of your mind as you're listening to the various founders that are building these companies. One is we are in the middle of this massive secular trend that's, in my opinion, a 30-year shift. We're 10 years into it, where we're organizing content, community, commerce online, and we're now starting to rebuild all these major sectors, healthcare, education, and some of the ones we're going to talk about today. So just try to get an appreciation for this long, interesting trend we're in the midst of. I think the second thing is that the way these industries are getting reimagined is using data and AI. And the question you should keep in the back of your minds is, well, who's going to take advantage of that opportunity? Is it going to be the kinds of companies that you're going to hear about today, or is it going to be the larger companies that have been around for decades? Are they going to be able to adapt and take advantage of data and AI and really migrate to this new era? And then I think the last thing is what's happening is you are generating new kinds of data in these different industries. And with that come interesting choices. What is the type of data you can and should be using, and what is the type of data that perhaps you should not be using? And the case where that's relevant today is just think about what happened in social media. And we have generated all this new data about how we live and how we communicate with each other online. And there's lots of benefit to it in the kinds of applications that have been built that we take advantage of. But at the same time, it's also been weaponized. Look what happened with elections. Look what happened, around bias and discrimination that we're seeing, and so on. So it's great responsibility also in terms of the opportunity that's in front of us. So with that, I'll stop there. I'll try to put it all together towards the end of the talk as well. But my first interviewee is Max Cantor. Max is the head of data at a company called Atrium, which is using AI to modernize the legal industry. How many of you have actually used legal services before? How many of you have felt that was a great experience? Well, hopefully Max and his team are going to be able to change that. So with that, Max. So why don't we spend a few minutes just give a sense of your background and talk about what Atrium is actually working on, then I'll lead us from there.
Sure. So I've been an engineer and a startup founder my whole life. I started in software. I worked in fintech for a while, running a trading desk at a hedge fund. Got back into technology, built a startup with a close friend of mine. We were able to build that through to acquisition. That was a startup that was focused on data extraction from documents. This is before the deep learning phase really took off and I really knew much about machine learning. So it was more a heuristic-driven system, but it worked well enough. After that acquisition, I was running a machine learning team at a PDF software company called Nitro. Did that for a bit. And one thing led to another, and I met Justin and Bebe, the founders of Atrium. When I was at Nitro, I always thought about how much low-hanging fruit there is in legal services. There's so much data trapped in documents, and we could never figure out the right go-to-market on selling to law firms. Issues like malincentives, like billable hours, disincentivizing law firms from pursuing efficiency, and other structural factors that make it hard for law firms to invest in technology, just put any go-to-market strategy that we had in the trash can. And I met Justin and Bebe, and they had a really interesting idea, which was don't sell to law firms, but be the law firm and run that law firm like a startup. And that idea clicked. I saw the growth that they were experiencing.
But just to interrupt you there for a second, I think that's a general trend where companies and ventures used to be, hey, let me go build software that these industries can use, in your case, the legal industry, and then all the entrepreneurs like yourselves have gotten emboldened to say, forget that, we will actually just do a full stack reinvention. I think that's what you guys are trying to do in this industry.
Exactly.
Yeah. Keep going.
Yes, okay. Yeah. So at Atrium, I joined back in January. They sold me on this model. I could see the growth, and as you could tell, not everyone was that delighted with their experiences with corporate law. And we are using AI and technology and processes to change that.
So talk through the complexity of what gets done in a law firm, right? Starts with, there's 1.5 million paralegals, and then, so there's a bunch of mechanical work, and then it gets more and more sophisticated. Where are we in that spectrum? What can we do today, and how do you see that developing using AI?
Today, we are not that far from where we were 20 or 30 years ago. The amount of low creativity...
That's not what Justin told us when he came to raise the capital.
Sorry, I'm talking about the legal industry in general.
Oh, okay.
That's
Ooh,
why
you scared me there.
Justin raised the capital.
Yeah, okay.
There's a huge amount of, and I finally got to see this from the inside, a huge amount of low creativity rote work. And that is Atrium's opportunity. We are improving that with processes, even simple things like being able to track signatures on a deal, one would think would be done, but it's done mostly with a paralegal ticking things off on an Excel sheet. Building a tool to track that was a huge efficiency gain for us, and it's super low-hanging fruit. What's really interesting is what we're building with machine learning and natural language processing that will let us extract data from documents, that will let us look at a company's corpus of documents, and from those documents, extract a single source of truth, be the single source of truth for company's revenue. How many employees are in the firm? Which employees are in good stead? What does the cap table look like? And this is not something you're tracking separate from your documents that can get out of sync, but something that flows directly from your documents. So if push comes to shove, what's reflected in your systems will be what's the legal ground truth in your documents.
So one way to think about that leverage, and I always just believe the productive use of AI is to figure out how to augment human potential. So the tools that you are building today and that work well today, in the case of paralegal, for example, how much work can a paralegal do because of the AI and automation that you're empowering them with today? Where do you think that is today?
So today, I would say that we've just scratched the surface, and we're already making if I were to pick a number, I would ballpark between 10 and 25% of paralegal time we've been able to accelerate with tools and with AI. Part of what paralegals do is grunt work, as we discussed. But there is some higher level, higher creativity tasks that they need to perform, right? Looking for signatures where they need to be, looking for certain terms in documents, making sure certain numbers add up. It's not as simple as pattern matching. And that's kind of the next frontier for some of what we're doing.
Yeah. So there's startups that are working on document discovery, content analysis, right? There's a bunch of other companies in the space. It's such a large market. How well does that work? And where are we sort of in, hey, data's going to train the AI, and what curve are we on over the next couple of years?
So I would say that AI has been a very empty but marketable buzzword for e-discovery for quite some years now.
Yeah.
E-discovery had a lot of technological improvement over the last 10 years. And while they've labeled their products as AI, I think they're actually starting to incorporate that with more fuzzy searching, soft searching, intent matching. One area that is driven more by natural language processing and AI is document review, automated document review, trying to understand which parts of a contract are in line with standard market practice versus which are outliers. There's some products on the market that do this for a very narrow class of documents. And the challenge that they have is getting access to the source data. And that's also stuff that we are looking at internally.
So it sounds to me like, okay, we're using some very early tools. We're creating some leverage. We're early in this space. I want us to walk us through for the next decade how this industry evolves. So like what what's going to be the major breakthrough where you say, okay, wow, we're really doing something spectacular using AI in this industry?
So this answer may disappoint. I don't think legal services is going to have a big bang moment in the same way that there's the time before self-driving cars and the time after, the time before iPhone and the time after. There will just be a very significant but incremental improvement. And 10 years from now, your experience working with a law firm won't look anything like what it does today. But that will have happened in such a gradual process. So for example, if you're doing a priced financing round, today I think the average time from term sheet to close is 45 days. We are already able to take quite a chunk off of that. And that's only going to go down further to the point where the only delay there will be in the negotiation. The human factor of what does the investor want, what does the founder want. All the other work will.
But some of that is because it's a very straightforward set of contracts, and you just got to, as long as you agree to them, you can generate those. But what about some of the smarter contracts? I mean, how does that evolve? And can you auto-generate these and smart contracts using blockchain? Is that sort of a reality anytime soon?
Sure. So smart contracts is a bit of an overloaded term, and I want to differentiate between blockchain smart contracts, which is essentially decentralized software, and smart contracts that are legal contracts represented in code that may or may not be on the blockchain. The former is actually a very interesting line of business for Atrium. We have a blockchain practice. Apparently, there's a bunch of laws around issuing securities, whether on the blockchain or not. And for companies that want to issue an ICO legally, we've actually had really good experience working with them. The software representation of contracts, which is the other form of smart contracts, is something that I personally find very interesting. I think that one area of the future for legal services is when we can fully represent the content and meaning of a contract beyond just extracting terms, extracting fields, but being able to model payment terms, warranties, representations. And that's something that is going to be a massive coordination problem. And for that reason, I think will take quite a few years, but 5 to 10 years away, we may start seeing much more services agreements represented algorithmically.
So 1.5 million paralegals in 10 years, how many are there?
I would say between 1 and 3. People often talk about AI eliminating jobs. And it doesn't eliminate as much as it displaces and transfers, as with any technology. There's this fear about job loss and automation. And in the legal industry, which I can speak to more, most of where we see AI going is augmenting attorneys, augmenting paralegals. So what that means is if you have a transaction, if you have something you need to get done, the legal costs, the transaction costs go down. And when transaction costs go down, transaction volume goes up. Because attorneys will be able to provide, or legal firms will provide services so much more cheaply, the cost of the financing goes down, the cost of a contract goes down. We'll see more contracts, more agreements going through. So I'm not an economist, I can't speak too intelligently about this, but I actually envision potentially more attorneys and paralegals. But what we will see is we'll see less of a pyramid structure with a partner covered by a few associates and then an army of paralegals beneath them, and more of a vertical structure, where you'll see kind of like a paralegal attorney pair that can, on their own, accomplish the same work because they're just doing the creative work, and the rote work is automated away.
So sounds like what you're basically saying is it's going to be very slow in this industry. You are creating some leverage. How do the existing large law firms that you're essentially taking business away from, and you're taking it away on these small companies that are starting today, but they're going to become big, and that business represents a lot of the future business that's coming your way. How are they going to compete? What do they have to do to compete with these modern day law firms like the one you're building?
Well, I want to say there's a difference between incremental and slow.
Yeah.
I think it will be fast, but I don't think there will be a single inflection point. So I think we'll see a very fast but gradual and incremental.
Well, there's two things. I think you might build a company that grows really fast, which I think is what you're addressing, and you might take share from other firms because you've got better cost structure. But the industry, from what you're describing, will fundamentally still operate largely the same. It's some technology leverage. It's not that you're automating it and lawyers are law is not a profession that's not here in 10 years. You're basically saying that's not going to change. We're not going to see much dent in that, right?
I think we'll see a lot of consolidation. We'll see law firms, some law firms will be able to adapt. They will be able to build out these data science and engineering teams that can take advantage of the huge amounts of data that they're generating. However, I think it's going to be very difficult because of the internal structure of law firms to make that transition. Because of the way partnerships are governed, it's very difficult for a partner to make that investment and to kind of steer that ship. Like it's hard for a Satya Nadella, the way he changed Microsoft, it's hard to do that in a law firm, however it might happen. Now, where that can happen much more quickly is with deregulation. If you look at Europe, certain legal services were deregulated, so they no longer have to be provided by law firms. So Accenture has started providing certain classes of legal services in Europe. Those firms will be able to adapt much more quickly. And then we'll see consolidations where if that comes to the US, Accenture might buy up law firms here, certain law firms will adapt, and others won't. And this, sorry.
So can I pop up for a second? So you use the word governance, right? I think there is this premise that if a lot of contracts get implemented in an automated fashion, you also need a automated fashion to govern, to make sure these are being enforced. And I think in one sense, that's okay that the whole industry is going to develop slowly, but then you do have another kind of governance happening, which is around these social platforms and how we organize our society today online, which is all algorithmically. And you have no idea what's happening in those black boxes. So how do you think about governance? So while it might be that we're in the slow path, but we might need some of this capability of automated, software-based, AI-based enforcement sooner than that, because we have certain sectors that are far more advanced. How do we get around that conundrum we find ourselves in?
Well, AI-driven governance is an extremely difficult issue, and I think we're quite far from it. You raise the issue of algorithmic contracts and enforcing them.
Yeah.
Where I see algorithmic contracts coming into play is as a convenience on top of the underlying paper contract. At the end of the day, shifting from paper or PDF contracts to an algorithm is not a technological problem as much as it's a huge social coordination. And I think we are many, many years from that. So what that means is that when push comes to shove and you end up in court or in litigation, that kind of goes away. And it's what's on paper, and it's a judge has to interpret that, or a jury. I'm not a litigator. I can't speak intelligently about that. And where you'll see AI start to play a role here is in, again, more in decision support and augmentation, where you might see particularly forward-looking jurisdictions investing in technology to help them process the huge amounts of data or documents that are involved in a court case. Now, the really interesting thing there is the social implications of the models that a judge uses to go through a ream of documents. If a private firm makes a mistake, or they don't fully understand the content of some document, that's essentially their mistake. It's between them and their clients. When a government institution does that, you have a whole different set of concerns you need to incorporate, right? If you're building a language model, and you're building that language model off some dialect, or, and by dialect I can even mean the writing style of New York lawyers versus San Francisco lawyers, you can encode biases into your systems to the point that you don't even see that those biases are there. And I think introducing transparency into modeling and systems and data sources to ensure that these models reflect the diversity and the openness that we want them to is going to be a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And it's a really interesting social problem.
Yeah, this is a large, complex topic, unsolvable. The reason I asked, and I think we'll stop after this, is what you'll see in a lot of these companies is while they're doing very early versions of what data and AI is going to be able to do, I think long-term implications of a lot of the work that you're building and companies like you're building that's where it's going to take us. And so, I'm very anxious to watch how this industry develops. Sounds like slower than I had sort of originally thought, even though you'll build great businesses there. But we do move towards an era where you start thinking about algorithmic accountability and explainability and using these legal contracts to measure and enforce that in our online societies. But Max, we'll stop there. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I do want to say it'll move fast, but it'll be gradual.
Yes. Fair enough. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
So I love you guys' story and how Nova started. Talk a bit about your background and what the company's doing, and then we'll go into the use of AI in financial services and lending in particular.
Of course. So as you might be able to hear from my accent, I'm from the UK originally. And my co-founders and I moved to the US. We're all immigrants. And when we came to the US, we tried to access financial services, apartments, and so forth, and found a system that locked us out. And so we at NovaCredit are building a cross-border credit bureau, which is a long way of saying that we integrate with credit bureaus all around the world, disparate data sets in different countries. We bring that data here to the US, and we deliver it to lenders or property managers so that they can now say yes to candidates that they previously rejected.
Yeah, so if you're a graduate student coming here, as a lot of my friends were from a different country, you can't get a credit card and you can't get an apartment for rent. And hopefully you guys are going to solve that. So let's talk about, broadly speaking, the lending industry for a second. So when I think about the creation of lots of new data about us as consumers, and I think about the application of that in the financial services industry, the obvious thing is how to rethink risk, right? Which is at the essence of lending. And you would say that ought to transform consumer lending and it should be on a fast pace. Now, you've cautioned against that. Give your views on how you think about the use of data in lending and where this is headed.
Yeah, so every time I go to a financial services conference, I have a number of amazing MIT grads who are wheeled out and they're sort of leading data science at various banks or fintech companies. And I think a lot of that, sadly, today actually remains marketing. So there's a lot of talk about new data sets and that unlocking new consumers. But in practice, it's very hard to find something that's more predictive than past borrowing behavior. For the vast majority of the population, we see that FICO scores still remain very predictive. Where they don't serve people is people who might be new graduates and haven't previously had a credit history, immigrants, or people who've had major life changes and whose situations have changed. Those models don't work there. But sort of the appetite around more broadly using social media data or psychometric data, that's very tricky. So for instance, we talked about this before, but there was a study that if you use all caps in your social media account, which I do very aggressively, if you use all caps in your social media account, you are a worse credit risk than if you use lowercase. Okay, insightful. So if I'm a lender, I should start lending only to people who use predominantly lowercase characters. But in practice, what ends up happening is that people who use all caps in their social media data are likely tied to particular socioeconomic groups and typically have been people of color. And so we find new ways that these data sets today can have adverse impact and actually end up in the sort of 21st century redlining. So what we've seen is that it's very hard to get adoption of these new data sets. It requires very responsible and regulatory friendly models. There are some interesting players trying to work in that space. But I think that in the US, it is not always going to be the key to unlocking financial access, is just using data sets and determining correlations.
So are you saying FICO is the best in class and that's what we're going to be relying on for a while, or like
Well,
there is more information, so how do we take advantage of it? Like, how does that get put in practice?
Yeah, well, I think the first piece is just there needs to be a lot of transparency and testing around the data. So there's a lender that you all may be familiar with called Upstart. They do a lot of AI and machine learning-based loans. They've actually worked with the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau and created an audit trail around some of their machine learning patterns so that the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau can then try and audit them and understand that there isn't an adverse impact from these models and that these models are removing variables that would do so. The other piece is that I think FICO is great for the vast majority of Americans, but there's that group that falls off by the wayside. And there I think it's about new data sets, but actually manufacturing data sets as well. So what we've seen in lending, what's powerful is not just can I take someone's public data and am I going to somehow manage to do better analytics than my competitor? Mostly you're going to get to the same outcome. But if you can be a player who somehow owns the transaction data of an individual, or you've lent to that player before and you've done this sort of like lending up model across a sort of ladder, that's where the power really lies.
So this is a Square example where they've got customers and they can lend to them in a small business setting, for example, right?
Yeah.
They have transaction data on them, and they understand how the business is doing.
And that data becomes proprietary to them, yeah.
So what are the use cases where AI will start impacting lending if it's not sort of broadly sort of, here's just an algorithm that will just lend off of? What are the applications where it starts to make an impact now?
And I don't mean to sound so negative on credit scoring either. There's definitely some applications, but they get inflated a little bit. You're being more
positive than Max. So.
I think the areas that are exciting are, first of all, fraud detection. This is a huge and growing space. So if you look at the financial industry post 9/11, the departments that have grown the most are compliance, anti-money laundering, follow the money. How do you ensure that when I transact with, I don't know, Mary is not a terrorist? And that's now my responsibility as a bank. Like that is what the law requires me to do. And so thinking about how can we use advanced signals in this to really detect what is happening in each individual transaction has been an area that actually both banks and fintechs are investing in. So American Express has been doing a lot around fraud detection, companies specifically on the payments piece, Visa, et cetera. And what's nice is you're seeing these cycles where that fraud detection is getting faster and faster. So where something would have taken days, now it gets picked up in hours. And that, all of the stream of solutions, the fact that it's so painful for me to test my identity in different ways, that's an area I find fascinating, despite sadly not playing in.
You mentioned American Express. Do you think the larger banks and institutions are actually investing heavily in this area already, or is this an opportunity for startups?
I think they are investing, some more so than others.
Mm-hmm.
Capital One is famous in the industry for having been the earliest adopter of analytics. And they've actually focused less, they do a lot on the data science piece, but they focused a lot actually on the consumer interaction. So using NLP to sort of now have chatbots that can help you make financial decisions, and which means that you can get information to a consumer who previously would be on an automated phone line or would have no way of getting information other than the internet, something much more reactive and dynamic. I think there's definitely opportunities for startups. I think whereas previously you've had major banks dominating this space, you're now seeing a lot of fintech and bank collaboration. So it's not really a disruption as much as it is using those technologies together. And there's a lot, for us, no bank does what we do because you need this sort of platform level. And I think that's true of particular use cases. I think that over time you get with these very specific, be that fraud detection or personal financial management, you need a verticalized play in it.
Yeah. So if you look at the broad financial services sector, China is clearly leapfrogging us because they didn't have a population that grew up on credit cards and a lot of the things. So a lot of these new companies have emerged. What can we learn from what's happening over there that can be brought here in this context?
I think China, so much.
Yeah.
China has a fascinating dynamic of regulatory involvement in the financial system. So if you look at the credit scoring industry, which is where I'm most familiar, you have a government-created credit registry. This was created about 10 years ago, and it's now the largest credit registry or credit bureau in the world. It has 410 million files. And so they sort of brought in FICO, had a custom score creation, and developed that overnight. And so
Does that mean only 410 million people have access to credit, or?
No, more people have access to credit. Those are people who have previously access to credit and therefore are in the registry. It actually has about 1 billion people in it. So 1 billion identities are in that registry, but 410 have previously deployed it. And so I think that's an interesting model of just like getting the government to build key components of infrastructure. And there's been a little bit of testing with licensees as well. What we see is that there is much more experimentation with data, much fewer of the restrictions that I was describing earlier. which definitely has some adverse impact, but in a market which is more credit-starved, is also creating much more rapid opportunities to deploy these data sets. So my credit score in China, if it were a credit sesame score, would include how often I visit my mother or various social parameters. Some of those you probably don't want to include, but some of those may enable access in third-tier Chinese cities to consumers who are previously locked out.
Consumers versus small businesses. Like in our firm, when we look at these opportunities, we always struggle with consumer lending because a lot of regulation and there's a lot of bad practices in the industry, and we've sort of shied away from businesses. Lending small businesses for companies like Square, as I was saying earlier, have actually shown a lot of opportunity. Do you think that's a burgeoning industry where there's a lot of companies that are going to be built or taking advantage of AI around fraud and sort of risk?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think small business underwriting is not at all as sophisticated as consumer underwriting is. So typically they just take the financials of the company and sort of add a percentage to the free cash flow and determine what they want to lend.
And since Dodd-Frank, the idea that small businesses can actually get access to debt it just doesn't work. I mean, there's so much regulatory stuff. All this money that was sent to states after 2008 was never actually given out to small businesses because there was no way to underwrite this risk.
Yeah.
That's why I'm asking. I mean, it's an unsolved problem in a really substantial way.
Yeah, I think that's. I think the two aren't quite as discrete as we like to think they are. So when you start really moving down to really small businesses, like us, like 30, 40, et cetera, employees, most of the underwriting is still based on the consumer's credit risk and a number of the directors and their behavior. And so it's interesting that there are such different models to serve them when there's so much overlap. And perhaps to your earlier question about China, it might be that we start, interesting elements there have been combining business identities with consumer identities. And so thinking about a very different cut of the individual and a consumer who has one financial identity, but that they deploy in different ways, in different channels as well.
Okay, so I want to take you 10 years out. You think about financial services. A lot of the work that's being done in crypto and blockchain, it was inspired by the banks failing in 2008, right? And so they're building new kinds of payment rails, and obviously, this is a core application where this is going to be used. The use of blockchain, companies like Circle and others, they're making headway to say, hey, here's a new payment rails, change the economic structure, and have a true trust-based system. There's no central authority. Do you think we head down that way? And as you're thinking about the global credit, and as global citizens, we have a credit that we can take anywhere with us. Like, how's that going to play out?
So don't know if I'm allowed to say this. I'm a little bit more skeptical on there's going to be no central authorities in financial systems. Blockchain couldn't even process the volumes of payments that currently happen in the US alone. What I think becomes really...
But it seems some of that infrastructure stuff will get solved. I mean,
Okay.
we're in the early 90s of the internet, right?
Yeah.
You can't build great applications on these tools today, but you will in a few years, or at least let's bet on it that enough smart people are working on this in the Valley that will solve those problems. Assume that technically it's feasible, then what?
I think I think blockchain is fascinating when combined with AI, because you start to create more of a concrete audit trail that you can use. So you can understand there's less of this black box problem that we were talking about earlier in the lending space. And so I think the combination of the two becomes really compelling. Now, no one has really figured out how to combine the two. Companies tend to go one side or another, and there's challenges to that. The question I think that remains is, when you have this blockchain, how do you have the consumer have control over that? If their identity is a key, but it's not necessarily fixed. And so there might be that they want to use more flexible subsets in a modular way to deploy it. But I actually feel very optimistic about those applications, for sure. And in credit reporting, I think we do need new standards. Everything that we've seen in the last few months has pointed towards the challenges of not only how do we prevent leaks on an information security side of things, but actually how do we help consumers have control, which is right now the only thing I can do is freeze and unfreeze my file. Yeah. And so I think new technologies become really exciting in that way. It just needs to be that the right use case has to be found for the decentralization rather than decentralization for its own sake.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I think the intersection with AI is where the applications will be, which is where the responsibility also lies. To your large caps example in terms of a correlation being used as causation, which is what's really going on. I think there's lots of cases like that. And this was the example of what I was saying earlier, that you'll have all these data patterns and you have to decide what you're going to use versus not to make sure there's a true equality in society in terms of the opportunities available to everybody. So we'll stop there. So we're going to move from law to financial services to now factory automation and IoT. So our next speaker is Sanjit Biswas. Sanjit is the founder and CEO of Samsara.
Hop up.
Awesome.
Great.
Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Sanjit, why don't we start with your background? I think it's interesting to talk about how, isn't there an ID required? Or is he an early entrant to MIT? So we'll talk to your background. I think it's interesting to just give a little bit of the Meraki story as well, because that's to me an on-ramp to where you're going now. So and then talk about Samsara.
Yeah, so quick background. I was at MIT as a grad student about 15 years ago, part of a PhD program in the computer science, or lab for computer science at the time. And we were basically studying wireless networking. We worked on that for about 4 or 5 years, built a pretty large wireless network that covered a lot of Cambridge with free Wi-Fi. This is over a decade ago, so it was kind of crazy at the time. Turned that into a company, which was called Meraki. The idea behind Meraki was to make it easy for anyone to build a network, wireless and eventually wired. That became a pretty exciting business. It grew to a significant scale, and then that became part of Cisco Systems. That was in 2012, about 5-6 years ago. And then I spent some time there, continuing to grow that. And more recently left to start a new company called Samsara, which is what we're working on today, where we're taking a lot of what we learned in terms of hardware and networking and wireless technologies and applying it to the world of industrial IoT. So how can we make sensors very inexpensive and easy to deploy, not just on the hardware side, but the full stack. So the software, the connectivity, and also the data collection and analysis. Because in operations, I think unlike IT, you don't have as many programmers. You don't have as many people who can take action on this data. So we can provide it in a way that works out of the box that has compelling value. So that's kind of what we're up to.
Yeah, so this is an industry that I would say 5 years ago it was very difficult to invest in, where you're actually going and trying to connect sensors into the cloud and control transportation as well as factories. It's really what we're talking about. We spent the last decade putting everybody online, humans online. We're now connecting places and things using sensors. I think that's the core mission of what you're doing. And the interesting thing is, the more companies like you succeed, the more data that's going to get generated that allows us to rethink these industries. So this is the beginning of a very long journey in transforming these. So can you talk about just why is it happening so quickly? I mean, there's yourselves and others. There's some very fascinating, fast-growing companies in the space today. Why is that happening today? And then what are the possibilities in terms of the kind of data that's generating the kinds of applications that you see?
Yeah, sure. So industry has actually been an area where automation, if you start with the advent of electricity, right, and kind of factory automation, had profound impact, and it's changed how we produce things and the volume we produce things at. Whenever there's been a major technological wave, it kind of crashes on the world of industry and actually compels a bunch of new trends. And I would say 30, 40 years ago, it was the first control systems, right? You started to see factory automation really come to fruition. We saw kind of automated assembly lines, starting with conveyor belts, but then everything kind of alongside that. More recently, I think what we're seeing is the advent of connectivity. Inexpensive sensors. If you think about an accelerometer 20 years ago was an expensive part because it's a pretty fragile instrument. Then MEMS revolution happened, accelerometers became cheaper, they started showing up in hard disk drives, then our smartphones, and now accelerometers on everything, right? Like the fingertips of the robot arm. So the same thing is happening now with connectivity. Connectivity 20 years ago was expensive, it was complicated, you put your servers online, but you wouldn't put every piece of equipment online. Now with wireless networking, you just connect everything, online. Right? So I think these are the drivers. And now I would say related to this panel the AI is starting to happen. As we now have all this data, we can act on it. And you can apply machine learning in an inexpensive way. You don't have to be Google to do it. You can actually do this in the strawberry processing plant and decide which strawberries are good and which strawberries are bad. That would have required a human process. It would have been kind of slow and time consuming and expensive. And now you can automate it, right? And that's the kind of transformation we're seeing.
So if you look at the two areas, transportation and factory, a lot of buzz around transportation because there's self-driving cars, so there's self-driving trucks, and obviously it's risky. We're moving physical things around, and there's a lot of regulation and safety issues. And then there's automation. How do you see these two playing out? What's going to happen first, and what are the kinds of use cases that come to mind?
Self-driving is certainly exciting, not just on the consumer side, but on the enterprise side, because so much of what the supply chain is about is moving product from one port or one warehouse down to a retail outlet or an end customer. So I think that's why it's gotten so much attention, because it's also something we see. And if you drive down I-5 or 880 or whatever, you'll just see all these big semis. What we don't see is what goes on inside a factory.
But for your factory, but there's also pretty compelling ROI examples, right?
Absolutely.
If on self-driving, when you think about your own business, you want to just talk through that a little bit as well?
Yeah, and that's
if
actually
you knew, if the data told you.
Right, and that's actually where we started. So our first sensor that kind of got mass adoption was a GPS tracking device. So you can install these inexpensively in semis and understand where the cargo is. One of the interesting things we learned, and we're outsiders to the world of industry, right? We're kind of IT and networking people. I was surprised to learn that anywhere from 25 to 40% of the trailers that you see on the highway are empty, right? So they drive empty because there's like a supply-demand mismatch. And it's not that there's actually no demand to fill those with cargo. People want to move product from everywhere to everywhere, and there's a kind of market clearing price. It's that the data is not connected into a marketplace. So you can't know that a trailer is running empty between point A and point B because someone probably would have paid you to put a sofa or something in there, right? Yeah. Things like that, where in the kind of world of transportation, even before self-driving happens, there's an appetite for data. So that's where we started. I think more recently we're seeing a pull into the factory. And this is an even more mysterious world because you really don't see what happens in those windowless boxes, right? And it's been fascinating how much automation has taken hold there. We have one customer, it's a cold storage company. They're the first or second largest cold storage company in the US. They have, of course, factory workers moving pallets of, if you had French fries at any of these fast food places, they've probably passed through one of these warehouses. They started automating their cold storage facility. And instead of having guys move stuff around with forklifts and run into each other, and it's pretty dangerous, they essentially have automated robots moving this stuff around. They can pack more in, and they can actually stack it higher. So their buildings are now like 8 to 10 stories tall. They can run them colder because there's no one you have to worry about, freezing in there. And they can actually run them without the lights on 24 hours a day, right? Which, if you don't have guys driving forklifts, you don't have to worry about so much lighting. It saves them 20%. 20% of their energy was not in keeping it cold, it was in keeping the lights on. And so eliminating that saved them a huge amount of money. So that's kind of a counterintuitive or maybe not so intuitive way to see what's going on.
So architecturally, I remember this one chart they showed me once where you've got nodes lighting up the entire country, where you've got these connected assets all over the world, all over the country in the cloud, and you can see what's happening with them. Architecturally, there's this huge chatter about edge computing. What is that, and is that real, and how does that get activated when you start having all these nodes that are actually lit up?
Yeah, so edge computing, for the folks that aren't familiar with the term, is this idea that you're going to do more processing at the very edge of the network, where the actual, the factory or the cargo is, that sort of thing, rather than in the cloud in the data center. I think we're actually starting to see more and more of that, especially if you think about an application like computer vision, for example. So one of our products is a dash cam. It basically looks at the front of the truck, but also at the driver. And there's enough computational horsepower available now that we can do computer vision to understand, is the driver's head kind of pointed out? Is his gaze or his or her gaze out the window, kind of paying attention? Are his eyelids open? But also, is he or she looking at their cell phone? Because that's a very hard problem to see, just with other sensors. So that's an example of edge computing. You can now, apply tens of gigaflops of computational power for a few dollars and a few watts, and it's commodity because it's stuff that's used in smartphones. So I think that's actually an interesting new technology trend. Before, you might have been able to see, how fast are they going or are they hitting the brakes, but being able to see where they're looking and if they're attentive, that's an example of edge computing.
Yeah. So as more and more of these nodes get lit up, at some point, Max was talking about this whole iPhone moment that happened in the mobile space.
Yeah.
What is the equivalent here? I mean, is there like a hyper innovation phase we're going to get into, and what does that look like when you think about it?
I think you see it in industry. We saw it with control systems that I mentioned. There were companies like Allen Bradley and Rockwell Automation in the 80s and 90s that really just started transforming how factories run.
Yeah.
They were initially small control systems, like little closed loops, and then they became distributed control systems that run entire factories and plants. We're seeing that iPhone moment now occur with basically the iPhone's technology, right? 10 years later in the industrial side. So things like machine health monitoring, you can take that accelerometer and the CPU from an iPhone, stick it on an induction motor, and understand, how much is it vibrating and is it likely to fail, not just today, but 2 weeks out, just from very kind of fine-grained changes. So I think that's exactly happening, and it's enabled by computation and inexpensive sensors.
Do you, this is a question I've asked the last two speakers as well. Do you think the larger companies will get their act together and do this? I mean, these are such fundamentally massive markets, right? It's not something that you alone could go do for the entire market or a few startups. Are they going to get there, or is this an opportunity for just a new set of GEs and Siemens and ABBs that are going to get created in the next 20 years in this space?
I think some will get there and some will not. And it's not an all or nothing sort of thing. So if you look at what happened 30, 40 years ago with kind of the mainframe to PC era, some of these brands are still very much around, but many of them aren't, right? Like the Burroughs and all these guys, like you don't hear about them anymore. So I think the companies that are aware of this and are investing in it are making headway. And then their question is, can they do it fast enough? Because the customer, if they can find something better, that's less expensive and more capable, they're going to just move, right? They have not deep loyalty to a brand necessarily. Yeah. That's the opportunity for startups and the opportunity for the big companies. But their cost
structures are such that they have factories and they build these really expensive devices that you guys take advantage of the mobile content and phones and make them a lot cheaper.
Right.
Can they ever cross that chasm?
I think if they really kind of put their minds to it, the real innovator's dilemma here is, are they likely to bring that less expensive product to market, knowing that they'll get paid less for it by the customer because it costs less to make, right? Yeah. So I think they have a slight disincentive, but at the same time, if they're aware of it from an existential perspective, they probably will make that change, which is why some of them will make the jump.
And in the intersection of AI and blockchain, asset tracking is really interesting use case when you think about transportation and logistics and the world you play in. Is that real? Is that a use case that you're starting to see, or it's more theoretical at this point?
I think the interest in it is very much real, specifically in the supply chain around food and beverage. So if you think about, how many of you guys heard about the E. coli outbreak or the Salmonella outbreak? Okay, so I don't even have to mention which one, right? Like there are so many of these going on. And it's because our kind of supply chain around food is becoming more and more complex, right? You might have consumed a salad today where the lettuce was grown in a different country. And so being able to understand where that came from, the provenance of that food is important. And that's where a distributed ledger like a blockchain is really valuable. So track and trace, I think, is really going to drive a lot of this. What'll probably be the catalyst is some kind of regulatory mandate where they say, look, these outbreaks are happening more and more often. They affect millions of people. People are getting sick, people are dying. We actually need some centralized or decentralized system to understand where this product came from. So I think that's going to be the driver, and the solution might be blockchain, it might be a central service, we don't know yet.
But that's not something you would think about in the next few years as?
Oh, it's on our list. I think we're just trying to understand, do the customers want it yet? Yeah. And they're kind of in wait and see mode. The reason blockchain's helpful is a lot of these interactions take place outside of regions of connectivity. So cell signal doesn't reach some of these warehouses. Within the warehouse, it might not reach every dock door, and you need 100% coverage. So having a distributed mechanism is pretty valuable, but I think our customers haven't quite gotten there yet. Yeah. So we see it as a technical solution, but not yet something people are ready to buy.
Yeah. So, I have a lot of respect for you. You're one of the best operators I know. Meraki, for those of you who don't know, was sold for $1.2 billion. this company Samsara is already worth more than that in just a handful of years. And when we sit here and talk about this, there's so many different directions you can go.
Yeah.
And again, it's not a winner-take-all market.
Yeah.
And you're growing as fast as you can. Like, how do you think about just what is the right physics to build this business with?
For those of you who don't know, Hemant's on my board, so he's wondering, like, how ambitious are you being?
No, but I'm serious. Like, it boggles my mind. Every
Yeah.
time I listen to you, each of these areas, you could say, is massive. You could build $1 billion business in any of these specific areas. Like,
Yeah.
how do you make those?
And I think multiple
choices?
billion-dollar companies will be built here.
Yeah.
There's companies like Flexport that are transforming logistics. There are, of course, all the kind of AI folks working on robotics within these warehouses and so on. So I don't think it's winner take all. I think it's a transformation that's occurring, and it creates a tremendous amount of opportunity, which is why there's ecosystem forming here. Yeah. For us, we look at, first of all, what our customers are asking us to build, and we, of course, want to build them more solutions to their problems. And then we look at other areas, maybe outside of our immediate domain, where we see our skill set, whether, for us, it's the intersection of hardware, software, networking, and, kind of the software side of things being applicable, right? Using commodity components, writing smart software systems. It's not for everyone, and so we have to be able to kind of look at the world through that lens and say, well, this is a bright spot for us. This one seems challenging, right? This might have a 20-year sales cycle. We can't transform that, but there's so many opportunities, we just have to have a sorted list, so that's how we think about it.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll stop there, and I'll try to put this together in a few closing statements, but thank you very much, Sanjit, for taking the time.
Thanks.
It's great. Yeah. I'm just going to say a few things just to wrap up. We talked about law, massive industry. We talked about credit and lending. We talked about IoT. And these are all areas that we would never touch 15 years ago as venture capitalists. And these are all areas we're absolutely salivating over today. So what happened? I think it is the whole creation of these platforms, being able to rent these various parts of the value chain to build full stack companies. That is a set of tools that all of you are now using to build these next generation businesses. The context of how to build these companies has completely changed. All of a sudden, it's very much about, do you have a deep sense of understanding of how to use data responsibly? Do you have the operating chops to understand that these markets are simply too big, and don't be obsessed with what others are doing, and think about how to just grow at a rate that's responsible for you? And are you building companies in a way that the decisions you're making today are not just good for your products, but also good for society as a whole? Because these are profound. I mean, we didn't talk about healthcare and education and other parts of financial services today. I mean, these are things that are deeply profound in changing lives for the country at large and globally. And so use of data is going to determine how far and how we can transform these industries, which all comes down to us. And to me, it's about how do you use data with algorithmic transparency, explainability, and accountability. And that is a lot of the dialogue that is being had in the industry, and that is a lot of sort of core principles that I would encourage all of you to think about as you're building your companies in these kinds of massive industries. With that, we'll conclude here. Thank you very much.